reckless policies, to get government to understand that they're not the solution to our problems, they're the source of our problems. That capitalism is a very dynamic system that works. It created the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and if we're going to get out of this mess, we have to embrace those principles, not run away from them. And we have to understand that the crisis that we've experienced was not a result of capitalism or a lack of regulation. It was because of an abundance of regulation. Regulation that distorted the free market. Regulation that created the moral hazards, that created the bubble. The recession, unfortunately, is necessary because it's the only cure that works for the government-created artificial boom. And if we don't let it run its course, we're never going to have a meaningful recovery. And if we ever want to get jobs, the only real economic stimulus that the government can provide is to shrink, is to make itself a smaller burden on average Americans. I know, as I mentioned, I started my own business in my apartment, my one-bedroom apartment. I couldn't do that today. The amount of regulation that already exists in the financial services industry, there is no way in the world I ever could have got my business off the ground. I couldn't have afforded it. I used to be my own compliance officer when I first started. Now I got 6 guys doing nothing but compliance. The laws are so complicated now, the rules are so complicated, and of course none of them stop Bernie Madoff. It's all unnecessary, redundant rules and regulations that do nothing but act as a barrier to entry to protect these large, too-big-to-fail firms from competition. And so it would, there's no way a young guy in their 20s could ever start a brokerage firm like I did. And so if we want to enable entrepreneurship and businesses, we need to shrink government. We need to cut government spending dramatically. We need to lower taxes, and we need to reduce regulations. And if we do all that, and we get sound money out of the Federal Reserve, the country will recover. It's going to be difficult because we are in a gigantic hole from decades of excessive borrowing and excessive spending. But the solution isn't to do more of the same. The solution isn't to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to recognize what led to this crisis and what government can do differently so that the market can begin to solve the problem. And I think the good news is, at least the polls that I just saw, I think Rasmussen polls shows every single Republican candidate is beating Chris Dodd. And if anybody in the Congress has got his fingerprints all over this crisis, it's Chris Dodd. I mean, he's been in there for 30 years, 36 years. He's never actually worked in the private sector. He's certainly never employed anybody. So he doesn't understand the problem. But we have an opportunity to not just replace Chris Dodd with a Republican, but with a Republican who really understands the problems in this country and who has a history of understanding them. It wasn't easy to go on television and point these problems out, knowing the type of reaction that I was going to get. It's not easy to try to rain on the parade or, try to, be the Grinch that steals everybody's Christmas. But we need somebody that understands that and has the courage and the commitment to articulate these principles in the United States Senate and try to prevent, this car that we're all driving from going off the edge of this economic cliff. Because Barack Obama talks about it all the time. He says, we got to change direction. He's changed nothing. All he's done is step on the gas, and we're headed for the same economic cliff that we were driving to before. But if I get there, and if I, and I can stand up like I am now in front of the Senate and try to convince the congressmen and the other senators to put their nation's interest ahead of their own political reelection, to understand that these are serious problems. It's not about just getting reelected. It's about doing the right thing so that we have a lasting recovery. We just don't want to find a way to tinker around the edges to try to stimulate the economy out of one recession and into a bigger recession, because ultimately we're going to get such an overdose of government stimulus that they will completely kill the economy. Anyway, I just want to thank everybody for giving me the opportunity to talk. If anyone has any questions about where I stand on anything, feel free to ask. Any questions?
Sure, I have a question.
Sure.
Great speech, and thank you for your interest in running for Senate. The conservatives, Republicans around here, many of us fiscally conservative, that's music to our ears. And it's a pleasure hearing that. We'd love for that view to be articulated in Washington. But in terms of becoming senator and winning the Republican nomination for that seat, you have some pretty strong competition. Is there any sort of thought or thinking that you can articulate as to how you'll differentiate yourself from Linda McMahon or others that are running for Senate?
Well, I think if you look at the way the race is shaping up, I mean, you have, Rob Simmons, who's been in Congress for, I think, 3 terms. I think he was part of the problem. He voted for a lot of the government spending that is the source of the problem. He certainly had a chance to speak up and warn about the economic crisis. He didn't say anything, so either he didn't understand the dynamic or didn't have the courage to speak up about it. So I don't know how sending him back to the Senate is going to change anything. I mean, I think if you're happy with the Republican Party leadership and you think they've been doing a good job, and you want to send somebody else that's going to fall and march lockstep with what they're saying, you can send them there. But I think it would be a waste of an opportunity. I think that the electorate is ready for a change. We don't have to dress up a Democrat and Republican clothing and hope to slip them through. Linda McMahon, I mean, I don't really know whether she's a Democrat or Republican. I mean, if Chris Dodd were a Republican, she might be running as a Democrat. She's got some business experience. I mean, she's been in show business her entire life. But I don't understand how that necessarily translates into an understanding of economics or an understanding of business in general, simply because her and her husband were able to run, World Wrestling, doesn't necessarily translate. I mean, I know they've made a lot of money running it. I don't, have anything against that. But, just having a lot of money and having been poor at one time, I don't think uniquely qualifies you. I think you contrast that to my experience. I not only have experience in business as an entrepreneur and understand, how government regulation and taxes has so undermined our economy, but I have a very strong background in economics and finance. And we have an economic crisis. We have a financial crisis. So I think sending one person to Washington that understands that makes a lot of sense. Because most of the congressmen and senators, they're clueless. This thing came out of left field. They had no idea that this was possible, despite the fact that it should have been obvious. So I think if we get a senator that actually understands economics, that's going to be powerful. And I think, I have a lot to bring to the party politically. I have a lot of supporters around the country that'll be able to volunteer on the campaign. I've raised money in the first quarter from over 10 or 15,000 people. I wasn't even in the race. I raised more money than my other opponents. I have over 15,000 volunteers nationwide who are going to be able to make phone calls and work on behalf of the campaign. So I've got this national, I've got an international following of people. So I have that. And I think from a lot of people, if you look at these 2 major candidates, a lot of people might not be happy with that choice, And I represent an alternative. I represent something different. And I think as more people are exposed to my message, and they will be, I just opened up my campaign headquarters last week. No, I was the last person into this race. And, when I started, I was in 5th place. So, now I'm in 3rd. But I just opened my headquarters. And in fact, it's in Milford. And if anybody has some free time on Thursday night, between 6 and 9, I'm having a grand opening party. There's information on it on my website. If you haven't been there, it's schiffforsenate.com.
Peter, what can you tell us other than what you already have about where you do stand financially? Linda has very deep pockets. How do you?
I mean, they're not as deep as Linda's, and I'm not as willing to reach into them as she is apparently. But will I throw a couple of $1 million into the race if I think it makes the difference? Sure. But am I going to just spend tens of millions of dollars right out of the gate? No. That's a lot of money for me to spend. I have to earn twice that much to keep that. And, so to spend that much after-tax dollars, on the race, but I don't think Linda can get the money from volunteers. I don't think she's going to be able to raise the money. So hopefully, I'll be able to raise the money. I think if I can't convince people around the country to send me money, how am I going to convince the people in Connecticut to give me their vote? So I think I've got a good chance of raising money, certainly in the primary. And hopefully, if I get the nomination, the national